Man saves a freezing bear cub. What he finds next is unbelievable. The Alaskan wilderness stretched endlessly before Logan Carter, a vast expanse of whitened silence, broken only by the occasional howl of the wind. Snow blanketed the landscape, swallowing everything in an icy embrace. The cabin, nestled between towering pines, was the only man-made structure for miles. Logan had chosen this solitude. He needed it. The world he once knew had crumbled when Emily passed, leaving him with nothing but ghosts and a longing to disappear. He had abandoned civilization for the certainty of the wild, where survival was simple, brutal but simple. Here he did not have to answer questions, did not have to explain why he could no longer be the man he once was. The quiet suited him, until the day it didn't. It started as a whisper beneath the wind, a faint whimper carried through the cold. Logan, gathering firewood, paused, his breath misting in the freezing air. He dismissed it at first, thinking it was the wind playing tricks, but then he heard it again, a weak, desperate cry. He turned, scanning the tree line. There, barely distinguishable from the snow, a small, dark shape struggled through the drifts. His first instinct was to walk away. He had spent too long trying to detach himself from the world, but something in the way the creature moved, its stumbling, its exhaustion, made him hesitate. Cursing under his breath, he set down the wood and trudged forward. The wind bit at his exposed skin as he approached. His boots sank deep into the snow, making each step an effort. The cub was barely larger than a medium-sized dog, its fur thick but clumped with ice. It lifted its head as Logan neared, its dark eyes dull with exhaustion and fear. A bear cub, no more than a few months old, alone in a winter that would surely kill it. Logan stopped short. If there was a cub, there had to be a mother. His pulse quickened, eyes darting to the trees. A full-grown grizzly would make short work of him if she thought he was a threat. But the woods remained still, no sign of movement. The cub let out another weak cry, pawing at the snow, trying to push itself up only to collapse again. Logan exhaled slowly. If the mother was alive, she would have been here by now. He knelt carefully, extending a gloved hand. The cub didn't flinch, too weak to resist. "Where's your mom, huh?" His voice came out hoarse from disuse. He looked around once more before sighing heavily. Damn it! Against every rule of survival, every instinct telling him to walk away, he scooped the cub into his arms. The small body shuddered violently against his chest. Beneath the thick fur, Logan could feel how thin it was. This wasn't just the cold. The cub had been starving. Whatever had happened to its mother, it had been alone for a while. Logan carried it back to the cabin, the weight surprisingly light. As he stepped inside, warmth engulfed them both, the fire he had stoked earlier still burning. He placed the cub on an old wool blanket near the hearth, watching as it barely moved, only a soft rise and fall of its chest, proving it was still alive. He grabbed a metal pot, pouring water from the kettle into it, letting it cool before placing it near the cub's muzzle. "Drink," he murmured. The cub sniffed weakly, but did not move. Logan swore under his breath. He knew nothing about nursing a bear back to health. He had spent years as a ranger, knew how to track them, how to avoid them when necessary. But this was different. He moved to the cabinet, rummaging through supplies. There wasn't much. He lived on canned goods and dried meat, things that would last through the winter. He found some honey. Emily had always insisted on keeping a jar, saying it was nature's perfect food. The thought made his chest tighten. He shook it off and scooped a small spoonful, kneeling beside the cub. "Come on, buddy, you need to eat." He touched the honey to the cub's nose. The reaction was sluggish at first, but then a small pink tongue flicked out, tasting the sweetness. Encouraged, Logan drizzled a little more onto his fingers, holding it near the cub's mouth. This time, it licked more eagerly. He sat back, watching the firelight flicker across the room. The cub still looked fragile, but its eyes had gained a fraction more focus. He sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "You better not make me regret this," he muttered. As if in response, the cub let out a small, tired huff and curled into the blanket. Logan exhaled slowly. He could still let it go in the morning, find a place in the woods where it might stand a chance. But even as the thought formed, he knew he wouldn't. Not yet. Morning came with a blinding light reflecting off the snow, seeping through the cabin window. Logan woke to the weight of something warm pressed against his leg. He cracked open one eye and found the cub curled beside him, its small body still shivering despite the heat of the fire. He had not invited it onto the bed, but apparently it had decided otherwise. He shook his head, moving carefully so as not to disturb it. He went about his morning ritual, checking the perimeter, ensuring his traps were set, collecting firewood. When he returned, the cub was awake, watching him with wary curiosity. Logan set down his haul and crouched near it. "You're looking a little better," he observed. The cub blinked at him. He rubbed a hand over his beard, sighing. "You're gonna need a name, aren't you?" He hadn't named anything in a long time. Names meant attachment, but he had already crossed that line the moment he carried the cub inside. He thought for a moment, then said, "Finn." It was simple, strong. The cub gave no indication of understanding, only shifting slightly, its paws stretching toward the fire. Logan shook his head, running a hand down his face. "Yeah, Finn it is." Days passed and Finn grew stronger. He followed Logan around the cabin, his small claws clicking against the wooden floor. He was still weak, still too thin, but there was a spark in him now, a determination to live. Logan had to admit it was something he recognized. At night, Finn curled into the blanket near the fire, his small snores filling the otherwise empty silence of the cabin. And for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't feel so suffocating. Logan told himself he was only keeping the cub alive until it was strong enough to fend for itself. That was all, but deep down, he knew better. Finn wasn't just surviving, he was making Logan live again. The days in the Alaskan wilderness blurred together, each one dictated by the rhythm of survival. Logan found himself falling into an unexpected routine, one he hadn't anticipated when he first carried the half-frozen bear cub into his cabin. Finn, as he had come to call the small creature, was growing stronger with each passing day, his once frail body slowly filling out, his movements becoming steadier. Logan watched with quiet curiosity as Finn explored his new world. The rough wooden floors of the cabin, the warmth of the fire, the smell of the stew simmering on the stove. The cub had an insatiable curiosity, sniffing at everything, nudging objects with his small nose, tipping over anything that wasn't securely in place. Logan found himself grumbling more often, but there was no real anger behind it. In truth, he hadn't realized just how silent his life had been until Finn arrived to disrupt it. One morning, Logan woke to the sound of rustling. He cracked open an eye and saw Finn attempting to climb onto the small table by the window, his little paws gripping at the edge, his round belly making the effort almost impossible. Logan exhaled slowly, watching as Finn finally lost his balance and tumbled back onto the floor with a soft grunt. The cub blinked, shook himself off, then turned his attention to Logan, letting out a small huff as if blaming him for the failure. "You're getting too bold for your own good," Logan muttered, pushing himself up from the cot. Finn sat down, staring at him expectantly. "Don't look at me like that. You're the one who decided to start climbing furniture." He ran a hand through his hair, sighing as he reached for his boots. The wind outside howled against the cabin walls, the morning light dimmed through the frost-covered windows. Logan knew he needed to check his traps, make sure they had enough food to last through the next storm. But the idea of leaving the cub alone, even for a short while, made his gut twist in a way he wasn't ready to analyze. Still, he bundled himself up, strapping on his thick coat and gloves. Finn watched every movement, his head tilting slightly as if trying to make sense of it. When Logan moved toward the door, the cub scrambled to his feet, letting out a small, insistent noise. Logan hesitated, his hand on the latch. "You think you're coming with me?" he asked, half amused. Finn let out another noise, this one more determined. Logan narrowed his eyes. "You're not ready for the cold yet." He stepped outside, shutting the door behind him before the cub could follow. The wind bit at his face immediately, sharp and unrelenting, but he had long since grown used to it. His boots crunched over the snow as he made his way toward the trees, the sky above a dull gray, promising more snowfall before the day was over. He checked the traps methodically, his hands moving on instinct. The quiet of the forest wrapped around him, a solitude he had once found comforting, but now felt strangely hollow. When he returned to the cabin, stomping the snow from his boots, he was met with a sight that made him pause. Finn had dragged the old blanket from the hearth and curled himself into it completely, his small form barely visible beneath the thick folds of fabric. Only the tip of his black nose peeked out. Logan exhaled, shaking his head. "Really?" He crouched beside the bundle, nudging the cub gently. Finn shifted, let out a soft sigh, then buried his face deeper into the blanket. Logan huffed. "You're going soft, kid." But if he was being honest, so was he. Over the next few weeks, Logan realized he had stopped thinking of Finn as a temporary guest. The cub had wormed his way into the cracks of Logan's carefully constructed solitude, filling spaces Logan had thought were long since dead. It wasn't just the noise Finn brought to the cabin, or the chaos of knocked-over furniture and half-chewed boots. It was the quiet moments, too. The way Finn would curl up near Logan's feet at night, the steady rise and fall of his small body, a reminder that Logan was no longer alone. The way Finn would watch him with wide, intelligent eyes mirroring his every movement. The way Logan found himself speaking more, not just to fill the silence, but because some part of him needed to. "You know, Emily would have liked you," Logan said one evening as he sat by the fire, carving a small piece of wood into something indistinct. Finn lay sprawled on his back beside him, his paws twitching slightly in sleep. "She had this thing for lost causes, strays, people too." He let out a dry chuckle. "Guess that's why she married me." His fingers paused over the carving. He hadn't said her name out loud in months. The sound of it filled the cabin in a way that was both painful and comforting. He glanced down at Finn, who had shifted in his sleep, one paw stretched out toward Logan, as if reaching for something. Logan sighed, setting the carving down. He reached out, resting a hand lightly on the cub's side. Finn stirred slightly, letting out a soft huff but not waking. Logan swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "She would have told me I needed to let you go," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "That a bear belongs in the wild, not in some broken-down cabin with a man who doesn't know how to move on." The thought of losing Finn made something in Logan's chest clench painfully, but he knew deep down that Emily would have been right. Finn was not meant to stay here. The cub was growing, his once clumsy movements turning more coordinated. He was still small, still dependent, but it wouldn't last. A time would come when Logan would have to make a choice. Keep Finn tethered to this cabin, to his own inability to let go, or give him the life he was meant for. For now, though, Logan let himself exist in the present. He let Finn curl up beside him, let the fire warm the room, let the snow outside fall in thick, silent waves. He had spent so long believing solitude was his only option, but now with the weight of a sleeping bear cub pressed against his side, Logan wasn't so sure. The Alaskan wilderness was not kind to those who hesitated. It was a land of instinct, where survival depended on knowing when to fight and when to flee. Logan had spent years understanding this balance, but as he watched Finn stumble through the snow, he wondered if the cub would ever learn it. The small bear, growing stronger by the day, had become bolder in his explorations. No longer content with staying inside the cabin, Finn had started venturing out into the cold, his dark nose sniffing at the air, his paws sinking into the drifts as he tested the world beyond the wooden walls that had sheltered him. Logan stood nearby, arms crossed against the chill, watching as Finn clumsily swatted at a tuft of snow that had fallen from a tree branch. The cub huffed in frustration when the snow crumbled beneath his touch, his head tilting as if the betrayal of solid becoming powder was something he would need to remember. Logan smirked. "Welcome to winter, kid," he muttered. Finn turned at the sound of his voice, ears flicking before he bounded toward Logan with a surprising burst of energy. He rammed into Logan's legs, not enough to knock him down, but enough to make his point. Logan sighed. "You're gonna be trouble, aren't you?" Finn responded by tugging at the hem of Logan's coat, his sharp baby teeth catching on the fabric. Logan shook his head, prying the cub off before trudging back toward the cabin, Finn following in his awkward, bouncing gait. The routine had become familiar. Mornings spent outside, afternoons by the fire, nights filled with Finn snoring at the foot of Logan's bed. It was a life Logan had never imagined, yet one he had somehow slipped into without realizing it. But nothing in the wilderness stayed the same for long. The first sign of change came with the tracks. Logan had been gathering wood when he spotted them, a trail cutting through the snow, deep grooves that didn't belong to a fox or a lynx. His pulse quickened. Wolves. He crouched beside the tracks, running his fingers through the imprints. Fresh, maybe a few hours old. He glanced toward the trees, his senses sharpening. Wolves were not an immediate threat to humans, but a lone bear cub? That was another matter. Logan straightened and turned back toward the cabin, his pace quickening. He found Finn near the porch, sniffing at the wind, his fur ruffled as if he, too, sensed something in the air. Logan crouched, gripping the cub's thickening scruff. "You need to be careful out here," he muttered. Finn made a small, protesting noise but didn't pull away. Logan exhaled. The cub was growing fast, but not fast enough. He was still vulnerable, still too small to defend himself. Logan knew it was only a matter of time before something in the wild tested that fact. The test came sooner than expected. That night, Logan woke to a sound that didn't belong. A low, distant howl carrying over the snow like a whisper of something watching. Finn stirred near the hearth, his ears twitching, his body shifting restlessly. Logan sat up, his breath visible in the cold air. He reached for his rifle out of habit, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. The cabin was sturdy, the fire bright. But wolves were patient. They watched. They waited. Logan had seen what happened when animals underestimated them. He wasn't about to let Finn become another lesson in the brutality of the wild. He rose quietly, stepping to the window. The moon was bright against the snow, casting long shadows across the landscape. At first he saw nothing. Then, movement. A flicker between the trees. Dark shapes slipping between the trunks. Silent as ghosts. Logan's grip on the rifle tightened. 3, maybe 4. Not a full pack, but enough. Enough to be dangerous. He turned back to Finn, who was watching him now, dark eyes wide and alert. "We're staying inside tonight," Logan said, his voice low. The cub didn't argue. He curled into himself, pressing against the warmth of the fire, but his small body remained tense, as if he understood the weight in Logan's words. The wolves did not come closer that night, but their presence remained. In the days that followed, their tracks circled the cabin, marking territory, testing the edges of Logan's claim. Logan did not panic. He knew how to handle wolves, how to make them understand that this was not an easy target. But Finn was a problem. The cub was curious, eager to explore beyond the safety of the cabin, and Logan knew it was only a matter of time before instinct called him to follow the scent of something unknown. That moment came on an early morning, when Logan stepped outside to fetch water from the stream. He had only been gone for a few minutes. When he returned, the cabin door was slightly ajar, the cold air seeping in like a breath of warning. Logan's stomach dropped. "Finn!" he called, stepping inside. But the cub was gone. The snow outside was marked with small paw prints leading toward the trees. Logan's heart slammed against his ribs as he grabbed his rifle, shoving his feet into his boots before following the tracks. "Damn it, Finn," he muttered under his breath as he moved swiftly through the trees. The cub's tracks wove in and out of the underbrush, meandering, aimless. Finn had wandered, not knowing the danger he was in. Logan's grip on his rifle tightened. The further the tracks led, the more uneasy he felt. Then he saw them. New tracks, larger, moving parallel to Finn's. The wolves had found him. Logan picked up speed, his breath sharp in the cold air. He heard it before he saw it, the low growl, the sound of movement in the snow. He broke through the trees into a small clearing, and there was Finn, standing frozen, his fur bristling, a small, terrified shape against the massive form of a wolf. The predator stood just feet away, its pale eyes locked onto the cub, its body coiled, ready to strike. Logan didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle, fired into the air. The shot cracked through the silence, and the wolf flinched, its head snapping toward Logan. He fired again, closer this time, and the wolf backed away, its gaze lingering on Finn for one long moment before it turned and vanished into the trees. Logan moved quickly, scooping Finn into his arms before the cub could react. "You stupid, reckless!" His voice was rough, but his grip was gentle, pressing the cub against his chest as he made his way back toward the cabin. Finn trembled but did not struggle. Logan could feel the rapid thudding of his small heart, the way his breath came in quick, shallow bursts. When they reached the cabin, Logan set the cub down, kneeling in front of him, hands gripping his fur. "You can't do that," he said, his voice tight. "You can't just wander off. You're not ready." Finn stared at him, ears pinned back, his small body still shaking from the encounter. Logan exhaled sharply. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion pressing heavy on his shoulders. "You're gonna get yourself killed," he muttered. That night, as Finn curled against him by the fire, Logan stared at the ceiling, his thoughts a storm of conflict. He had saved the cub once. He had saved him again. But how many times could he protect him from a world that was not meant to be kind? Finn was growing, but not fast enough. And Logan knew, with a sinking certainty, that he could not keep him safe forever. The days after the wolf encounter passed in uneasy silence. Finn no longer ventured near the door when Logan left. No longer bounced toward the edge of the trees with that reckless curiosity that once defined him. He stuck close instead, his dark eyes watching Logan's every move, his small body pressed against the warmth of the fire at night. Logan should have felt relief, knowing the cub wouldn't put himself in danger again, but instead there was a strange weight settling in his chest. He had seen it before in animals that had lost their mothers. Fear, the kind that didn't fade with time. Finn had learned something that day, something Logan wished he hadn't. The world outside their cabin wasn't just cold, it was cruel. The first heavy snowfall of the season arrived with little warning. The wind roared through the trees and the sky turned into a swirling blur of white. Logan worked methodically, securing the cabin, reinforcing the firewood stack inside, making sure the storm wouldn't bury them in. Finn padded after him as he moved, no longer bumbling the way he once had, but with the quiet presence of something that was learning. Logan could feel the weight of the cub's gaze on him as he worked, but he didn't speak. What was there to say? He had brought Finn inside weeks ago believing it was temporary, believing that once the cub was strong enough, he would let him go. But the thought of that now made Logan's hands pause, made something twist deep in his gut. That night the storm raged, howling against the wooden walls like some furious, unseen beast. The fire crackled in defiance, casting flickering shadows across the cabin, painting the room in a soft amber glow. Logan sat in his usual chair, his rifle resting against the wall nearby, his hands working absent-mindedly at the whittling knife he had taken up more out of habit than necessity. Finn lay curled near the hearth, but he wasn't sleeping. His ears twitched at every gust of wind, his small claws flexing against the wooden floor, his body tensed in a way that had become more frequent lately. Logan studied him for a long moment before setting down the knife. "You're thinking about out there, aren't you?" Logan's voice was rough from disuse, but it filled the silence, made Finn's ears perk slightly. "You feel it, don't you? That pull?" He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know, kid." "I do." Finn shifted, his dark eyes locking onto Logan's, unblinking, searching. Logan exhaled, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not meant to stay here," he admitted. The words felt like stones in his throat. Finn didn't move, but Logan knew he understood. Maybe not the words, but the meaning. The cub was growing. His paws, once clumsy, now carried him with steady confidence. His body, once fragile, was filling out with the promise of what he would become. The truth was unavoidable. Logan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm rage. "Emily used to tell me I was stubborn," he murmured. "Said I held on too tight to things. Never knew when to let go." He huffed a small, humorless laugh. She was right. He looked at Finn again, his jaw tightening. "You've got a life out there, Finn. A real one. And keeping you here, it's not fair to you." His voice caught slightly on the last words, but he forced them out. He had saved the cub once. He had saved him again. But keeping him here, tethering him to a man who had long since forgotten how to live, was no salvation. It was selfishness. The storm finally broke at dawn, leaving the world buried beneath thick, untouched snow. The sun barely crept over the horizon, casting a dull, cold light across the landscape. Logan stood at the edge of the trees, his breath curling in the frigid air, Finn beside him. The cub sniffed at the wind, his body tense with something unreadable. Logan exhaled. "Tracks are fresh," he murmured, more to himself than anything. He had scouted the area earlier, knowing the wolves had been close again. Their prints wove through the trees, their presence an unspoken reminder. Finn would have to learn to navigate their world sooner rather than later. Logan crouched, resting a hand lightly on Finn's back. The cub turned to him, eyes sharp, waiting. Logan hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small leather strap. It wasn't much, but it had once been a part of Emily's old pack, something she had always carried with her on their hikes, a piece of her that had somehow remained when everything else had gone. He wrapped it around Finn's front paw loosely, letting it sit there for a moment before pulling it away. "You won't remember me," he said quietly. "Not forever. You'll go out there. You'll live your life. And this cabin, this winter, it'll just be a small part of it." His voice was steady, but the weight in his chest was suffocating. Finn nudged at Logan's hand, his small nose cold against his fingers. Logan exhaled sharply, blinking against the sting behind his eyes. He clenched his jaw, pushing himself to his feet. "Go on," he said, voice rough. Finn didn't move. Logan swallowed. "Finn, go." He took a step back. The cub watched him, ears twitching, hesitation in every muscle of his body. Then slowly, he turned. Logan stood still as Finn padded forward, his steps uncertain at first, then stronger. The cub stopped once, halfway between the cabin and the trees, looking back. Logan didn't move, didn't breathe, and then Finn was gone, swallowed by the wilderness. Logan stayed where he was, staring at the place where Finn had disappeared, his hands clenched at his sides. The cold bit at his skin, but he didn't move, not until the sky turned from pale blue to gray, not until the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of pine and earth and something unfamiliar. Only then did he turn back toward the cabin, his steps slow, deliberate. Inside, the fire still burned, the warmth wrapping around him like something distant, something that didn't quite reach the hollow space Finn had left behind. Logan sat heavily in his chair, staring at the flames, listening to the silence. It was different now. It was emptier. The cabin was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. Logan had lived in silence for so long, had built his life around the absence of sound. But this was different. This quiet was hollow, stretched too thin, as if the walls themselves could feel the absence of the small creature that had once filled the space with soft huffs and clumsy footsteps. The fire still burned, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls. But it did nothing to push away the emptiness creeping in around the edges of the room. Logan sat in his chair, staring at the place near the hearth where Finn had once curled up, where his small body had fit so perfectly against the warmth. Now there was nothing but an old blanket, folded neatly, untouched. Logan exhaled sharply and ran a hand down his face, willing himself to let it go. This was the right thing. He had always known it would come to this. Finn belonged to the wild, not to the confines of a cabin built for a man who had spent too long running from the world. The cub would grow, would become what nature intended him to be. It was the only way. Still, Logan found himself stepping outside more often than he used to, scanning the tree line, listening. The wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, untouched, indifferent. Finn was out there somewhere, learning how to survive, learning what it meant to be free. Logan told himself that was enough, but at night when the wind howled against the cabin and the loneliness pressed in too hard, he wondered if the cub had already forgotten him, if he had already become nothing more than a faded scent on a blanket, a moment lost in the vast, unrelenting expanse of the wild. The days dragged into weeks, winter tightening its grip around the land. Logan fell back into routine, checking his traps, reinforcing the cabin, hunting when the weather allowed. He told himself that nothing had changed, that life had simply returned to what it had been before Finn. But it was a lie, and he knew it. The cabin was too quiet. The woods were too empty. Logan hadn't realized just how much of himself he had given to the cub until he was gone. He had spent so long avoiding attachment, avoiding anything that might tether him to the world again. And then Finn had come, uninvited, a small bundle of fur and stubbornness that had forced its way into Logan's life, into the spaces he had sworn to keep empty. One morning, Logan woke to a sound that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was the wind, the way it sometimes moaned through the trees, shifting the snow in soft, deceptive whispers. But then he heard it again, a low, rumbling noise, deep and steady, a sound that sent something sharp and immediate through his chest. Logan pushed himself up, heart hammering, listening. The cabin door creaked slightly as he stepped outside, the air biting against his skin. The snow was thick, undisturbed except for a single winding path of tracks leading from the trees. Large tracks, bear tracks. Logan's breath caught. His eyes followed the trail instinctively, his pulse roaring in his ears. The tracks led toward the clearing just beyond the tree line, where the morning light cast a pale glow over the snow-covered ground. He stepped forward, boots crunching against the frozen earth, and then he saw him. Finn. No longer the small, fragile cub Logan had carried through the snow weeks ago, but something stronger, something more. His coat was thick now, his body lean and powerful, his dark eyes sharp with the knowledge of the wild. But it was him, and he was waiting. Logan stopped a few feet away, unsure, unwilling to move too fast, as if one wrong step might shatter whatever had brought Finn back to this place. The bear huffed, his breath curling into the cold air, his massive paws shifting against the snow. Logan swallowed hard, his throat tight, his chest aching in a way he couldn't name. "You remember," he said, the words barely more than a whisper. Finn blinked, tilting his head slightly, the way he had always done when he was trying to understand something. Logan let out a rough laugh, shaking his head. "Damn stubborn bear." They stood like that for a long time, the space between them filled with something unspoken, something heavier than words. Finn had changed, had become something untouchable, something that belonged to the untamed world beyond the cabin. And yet, he had come back. Not because he needed Logan, not because he couldn't survive without him, but because some part of him still remembered, still recognized the man who had once pulled him from the snow and carried him toward warmth. Logan took a slow step forward, his movements careful, deliberate. Finn didn't move away. Logan raised a hand slightly, not to touch, but to offer. Finn huffed again, then turned, his massive form shifting effortlessly as he moved back toward the trees. Logan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, watching as the bear disappeared into the forest once more. He didn't follow, he didn't call out. This was what it was meant to be. Finn had returned, not to stay, but to remind Logan of something he had long since forgotten. That the world did not end with loss, that the past did not have to define the future, that healing was not found in isolation, but in the quiet, persistent presence of something that refused to be forgotten. Logan turned back toward the cabin, his steps slow, deliberate. The fire inside would still be burning, the warmth waiting for him. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let it in.